Okay, this is 1.4 notes data collection. So the first thing we're going to talk about is bias. You've probably heard this a lot. In the world of statistics, what does bias mean? Bias happens when a sample taken doesn't perfectly represent the population it is testing. Okay, so bias is actually really important. We want to limit bias. Our goal is not bias. Okay, no bias. That is actually very difficult to create, which you should have learned in Math 3, and now you'll see again in this class. I'm not going to talk about every type of sampling technique. There are some in your book that I'm not going to go over that, yes, you are responsible for. So make sure you actually look in your book for the other types. I'm going to go over the 5 most common. The first is random. Okay, the goal is obviously to have unbiased survey or sample. This can only be accomplished with a random sample. Okay, this isn't as easy to accomplish as you may think. Let's say I need to select 5 students. If I close my eyes and just randomly point it at 5 people in the room, that's not random. There are some conscious and unconscious biases going on. A truly random sample or survey takes away any judgment on the part of the person doing the selecting. Okay, so we have 2 ways that are kind of used to be used, I guess. The old school way, not used very often or really ever anymore. But that is put everyone's name in a hat, draw 5 names out. Okay. The new way, the way we do it is using a computer with a random number generator. Okay. So you make a list of all the names, number each name, and then a computer tells you which numbers are going to be in your sample. And a computer can randomly select without bias, because it doesn't have bias, it's a computer, and that's how you can create this. Okay? Every student in the room would have a code corresponding to their position on my class roster. The first student would be assigned 1, the last student would be assigned 34, assuming 34 students in the class. We would program the computer to select a certain number of people using the random number generator program. Okay, so population, all, I'm going to put that in caps because that's important for population, students in class. Okay, a population is all. It always should have all in it because it is a big group. Sample, we're going to select 5 students, right? We said we're going to select 5 students using the random number generator. Okay, and then bias, none. This is the only one, there's no bias, right? Every single person has a number, every single person has equal opportunity to be selected. That is no bias. Okay. Just to let you know, random, I mean, you can think of it as unbiased, but it's also, you got to think of it as equal probability or opportunity. Okay, that's what makes something random. Everything has equal probability of being selected. Okay, the next one is the systematic sample. So I guess I'll number these. So the first common thing is a random. It's the best one. If you can do a random sample, you should do a random sample. But lots of times it's not easy to do a random sample if you think you have to have a physical list. There's some things you cannot physically list if you're sampling them. So we have other methods. The next method, systematic, if the person who is selecting the sample or survey follows a defined pattern. Okay, that's the key part here, defined pattern. So it's going to be, I think in your book it talks about the kth or nth term. I'll say nth, most people understand that more. Nth term. Okay, so if you have a defined pattern, it's systematic. The president of an amusement park is curious as to whether customers think it was a good idea to spend millions of dollars on a brand new roller coaster. It is the first day of operations for the new roller coaster, and the line is a 2-hour wait. To survey park guests, he asks every 20th person. You see that? That is the pattern. The nth term, the 20th value in this case. Okay? So every 20th person in line waiting to ride the roller coaster. All right? So the population he was trying to get is all people in the park. Okay? He sampled every 20th guest in line. And bias. Yes, there are bias. They are waiting 2 hours. They probably like it. So notice he's not interviewing them after the ride. He's interviewing the people that are in line for the ride. So if they're willing to wait 2 hours to ride it, they'll probably like it. Okay? A better spot still would have bias, but a better spot would be the entrance to the park, right? He could every 20th person interview the person walking by, because they might not be going to this new roller coaster, but there's still bias there. It's the first day of operations. It's probably a popular thing. Most of these people would be going to see the new roller coaster. Okay, so there is always bias there. You can limit your bias, but you can't really get rid of it completely unless it's a random sample. Okay, so I will say this is a good sample if done correctly. The random sample, I'll call it best. That is the best. That's your goal. Okay, but if you have to use a systematic sample, that's fine. Third, you can tell by the name, convenience sample, this is a bad sample. It's actually a common sample, which is sad, but it is a bad sample. It almost never represents the population. As the title implies, a convenience method of sampling is where you create a quick and easy way to sample. Okay, so an example of this is a school principal wants to randomly survey students whether or not soda should be allowed to be sold on campus. Each counselor is given 20 surveys to hand out during lunch. One counselor decides to pick a classroom by one of the exit doors and hands the surveys out to the students who come out of that classroom when the bell rings. Okay, the counselor has handed out his or her survey in less than 1 minute. So, population. They wanted the population to be all the students. This counselor, we don't know all the sample, okay? They handed him to multiple counselors, but this counselor said 20 students in that class. Right? That's it. They just handed it to one class. I mean, that is a very poor sample, right? This person is looking at one demographic, basically. It might be all freshmen, it might be all seniors, it might be nutritional health class or something like that, which would all affect this. There are lots of things. So what type of class? There's bias there. Other students, right? There's a lot of other students at the school. There's bias there, and so on. There's all sorts of things that make this bias. And if you ever take a convenience sample, you'll find it's a bad way to sample. Number 4, self-selected. Okay, in this type of survey, the participant isn't actually selected. The participant volunteers. Okay, that's what makes this type of survey. Simply due to the fact that he is interested or she is interested in the topic and has become aware of the issue. You saw your congresswoman on the news last night, and she was talking about an upcoming bill that she was going to vote for. She said she wanted to hear from people in her district as to what they thought of the issue. Since you know of this bill and oppose it, you call her local office and you write her an email regarding your opposition. Okay? This is, I'll just say, usually bad. Not as bad as convenience, but usually. Okay? There is a specific time where this might be okay, because a self-selected survey is going to get you the extremes. So if you need only the extremes for some reason, which is not a good representation of a population at all usually, but if you want the extremes, this is a good survey. Other than that, it's a bad survey. It does not represent it well. Okay, so in this case, they wanted all voters in the district. Okay, the sample was anyone who contacted. And the bias is only the extremes will contact. But what I mean by the extremes is, in this case, if someone is really for the bill or really against the bill, those are the ones that are contact. If there's someone, all the people in the middle that like, oh, it might be good or it might be bad, but we'll see kind of mentality, they're not going to contact. Why would you waste your time to contact if that's your mentality? Okay, so only the extremes will contact. So that's why this is usually bad, because it's not a good representation of the population as a whole. This is a representation of the extreme thinking. So that is usually a bad survey when you have self-selected. The next one, Stratify. This is actually back to a good sample. Remember, it's not best. There's still bias, even if you do it 100% correct, but there's still bias. Okay? So in this type of method, the population is divided into subgroups. Okay, we call these strata. That's where the term stratified comes from. I think it's a Latin root. I can't remember exactly, but it's strata. And that's what these subgroups are called. That's where stratified comes from. And then random samples are taken from within each subgroup. Okay, so we then randomly take samples within each separated subgroup. So you might separate it by race or age or education or income, something like that. And then once you break it up, you're going to take a sample from each of those created sections, basically. Okay. So where you might use this is there's 5 elementary schools which feed into Clovis North. If they want to make sure every elementary school is represented, they have to use a stratified sample. Otherwise, they might just get people from 3 of the 4 or whatever, or 4 of the 5 elementary schools, which means 1 is left out. Okay, so Clovis North administrators wish to survey 100 6th grade parents regarding the use of laptops next year when their child will be in 7th grade. The administration wants to make sure that parents from each feeder school participate. So they divide the population into the separate schools, then randomly select 20 parents from each. So the population is all, I guess, Clovis North, 6th grade parents. Okay. And they sampled 100 parents. If you don't understand where I got that, it's 20 from 5 schools. Right, if I get 20 from each school, that would be a total of 100 parents. Bias. Okay. The bias is every parent will not have equal chance. Okay. It's not random, right? If there's more parents at one school than another school, the school with the more parents, those parents have a less likelihood of being selected. That is the only bias here. This is a well done stratified. So we had an example of a poorly done systematic sample, right? There's lots of bias there, but if the park owner had done it better, they would have limited the bias. The stratified is an example of a really well done one. They got what they wanted. They got 20 parents from each school separated into our strata. The schools are the strata. Okay. And every parent will not have an equal chance, though. There is slight bias. It's not perfectly random. Okay. So those are the 5 I'm going to go over. I will tell you there's cluster sample, judgment sample, probability sample. I think those are the only 3 that you have to go through on your own. So I'm actually going to talk about those real quick. Cluster samples is very similar to stratified. So you separate into little groups, but in a cluster sample, you just survey like 3 of the 5 groups. Okay, that would be a cluster. So we take 3 of the 5 groups, cluster sample. Then you have probability sample. It's based on the probabilities. So if you don't have equal probability, you sample based on probabilities, which all of these happen to actually be probability samples. And then you have judgment samples. Judgment sample is its own little category. It's a bad sample usually, but that is where you use your ideas to sample. So maybe I'm trying to sample my students, and I think I should sample the D's and F students because they're going to give me the most information. So I only sample D and F students. Okay, it's based on my judgment. Okay, so those are the other ones you're going to have to know. Okay, you can read your book. They have examples of all of those. All right, so make sure you write out your 3 sentence summaries. You could actually do a sentence per sample that I did not go over. You could add that to your summary. That might be a good thing to go through. Look in your book, write a sentence per other 3 sampling techniques. Good luck.